Listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you is not the kind of story you find in polite history books. It is not a lesson from a classroom or a tale softened by patriotic revision. No, this is the story whispered in the shadows, preserved in fragments of court transcripts, and silenced by those who understood how dangerous the truth really was. A story so disturbing that if you let it in, if you really hear it, you will never again look at justice or power the same way. June 1855, Missouri. A young enslaved woman named Celia, only 19 years old, sat inside a small brick cabin on the edge of her master's farm. By that point, her body had been broken by 5 years of nightly abuse, beginning when she was just 14. Her spirit had been dragged through terror most of us cannot imagine, and yet on that suffocating summer night, something inside her changed. She had begged, she had pleaded, she had prayed, and still her master came, always, until finally she prepared for the unthinkable. And here is the part history tried to bury, because Celia's story wasn't just about survival, it wasn't even just about revenge. It was about defiance against a system so corrupt, so monstrously institutionalized, that killing one man meant declaring war on the very concept of ownership itself. She wasn't supposed to have a will, she wasn't supposed to have a choice, and she wasn't supposed to fight back. But she did. That night, when Robert Newsom, the man who claimed to own her, stepped into her cabin for yet another assault, Celia was waiting. In her hands was a wooden club, heavy and jagged, placed there hours earlier with one purpose only, and in a heartbeat she crossed the line no slave was ever supposed to cross. With a single blow she struck down not only her abuser, but also the illusion of absolute power that sustained an empire. The body fell. The silence thickened. And Celia stood over him trembling, knowing she had just shattered the invisible chains of fear. What came next would horrify a nation, ignite one of the most controversial trials in American history, and expose the cruel hypocrisy of a justice system built not to protect the innocent, but to protect the institution of slavery itself. This is the forbidden story of Celia, Missouri, 1855. On the surface it looked like a land of opportunity, fertile soil, growing towns, and the steady hum of commerce along the rivers. But beneath that surface was rot, the kind that ate through the foundations of morality itself. The land was soaked not just in sweat, but in blood, and at its center stood men like Robert Newsom. Newsom was not a monster in the way history prefers to label its villains. No, he was something worse. He was ordinary, a farmer, a father, a man respected in his community, a man who sat in church pews on Sunday mornings and spoke with the voice of authority. And that ordinariness was the true horror, because in his world, brutality wasn't considered monstrous. It was routine, it was legal, it was the machinery of slavery functioning exactly as designed. When his wife died in 1849, the last restraint on his darkest impulses vanished. Soon after he purchased Celia, a girl barely 14, bought not for her labor, but for his appetite. From the very journey home before she even set foot on his farm, he made his intentions clear. That night marked the beginning of 5 years of relentless abuse, 5 years of a body treated as property, of nights that blurred into nightmares. Newsom built her a cabin just 50 yards from the main house. To outsiders, it was presented as a place for the family cook, but everyone knew. His daughters knew, the slaves on the farm knew, the neighbors suspected. It was not a home, it was a private prison, a sanctuary for his power. Here no law could reach. Because in Missouri, as in every slave state, the rape of an enslaved woman was not a crime. The law recognized her only as property, and man could not violate what he owned. Think about that. An entire legal system engineered to protect the abuser, to sanctify his control, and to erase the humanity of the abused. That is what Celia lived in. A world where her cries meant nothing. A world where even her children, born from those violations, became his property. By 1855, she had given him 2 children. She was pregnant again, and while her body weakened, his visits did not stop. Night after night, the walk across the yard, the creak of the cabin door, the sound of footsteps she had come to dread. He thought she would never resist. He thought her silence was permanent. But he was wrong. By the summer of 1855, Celia had reached a breaking point. Her body carried the weight of years of violation, but it was her spirit that now rose against him. She had learned something dangerous. When a human being has nothing left to lose, fear can transform into fire. Celia went to Robert Newsom's daughters. She begged them to intervene. She told them she was pregnant again, that she could not endure another forced encounter. She pleaded for mercy, not from him, but from those who might hold some fragment of influence over his habits. But the daughters, bound by silence and the hierarchy of their world, did nothing. They turned away. So Celia made a decision. Alone, isolated, with no law to protect her, she resolved to carve her own justice. She prepared herself in the only way she could. A heavy stick, hidden inside her cabin, waiting for the night she knew would come. On June 23rd, 1855, the day stretched like any other. The farm hummed with labor. The sun sank into the Missouri fields. But Celia knew. She felt it before it happened, the inevitability of footsteps crossing the yard. Robert Newsom was coming. He always came. That night he entered her cabin again. He expected submission, silence, the ritual he had repeated for years. But this time, she met him with defiance. As he advanced, Celia raised the stick and struck. Once, twice. The blows were brutal, final. Robert Newsom collapsed to the cabin floor, the weight of his life ending in the very place he had used to desecrate hers. For a moment the world stood still. Imagine the silence of that room, the crackling fire, the scent of sweat and wood, the body of the man who had owned her now lifeless at her feet. For the first time in years, she had control. But there was no triumph. There was only terror. Because Celia knew what the law would say. She was not a woman defending herself. She was property destroying property. And in Missouri, that was unforgivable. She called 2 enslaved men, George and another field hand, to help. Together they burned Newsom's body in the fireplace. Ash, bone, fragments scattered into the fields. By morning the master of the house was gone. But secrets like this never stay buried. By the next day, whispers were moving across the county. Robert Newsom had vanished, and suspicion fell on the girl who had always been closest to him. The morning after Robert Newsom's disappearance, unease spread across the farm like smoke. His daughters noticed his absence at breakfast. The neighbors whispered. By noon, the questions began. Where was the master? Why had no one seen him leave? The unease hardened into suspicion, and suspicion always seeks the weakest link. All eyes turned toward Celia. She had lived in the cabin nearest to him. She had borne his children. Everyone knew the truth, though none would speak it openly. The silence of the community was not ignorance, it was complicity. They had known what Robert Newsom did to her. They had known for years, and now they knew what she had done in return. On June 24, 1855, Celia was taken into custody. She was interrogated for hours, pressed and cornered by men who demanded a confession. At first, she denied it, but the weight of their voices, the threat of violence, and the inevitability of her fate bore down on her. Eventually, she admitted what she had done. She told them of the night in her cabin. She told them of the stick, the blows, the fire that consumed him. She told them she could no longer endure his nightly visits, especially while pregnant. But here lies the tragedy. Her confession was not taken as the cry of a woman defending herself. It was taken as the words of property destroying its owner. In the eyes of Missouri law, she had no right to resist him. The court would not ask if Robert Newsom had forced her. They would not ask if she had suffered. They would ask only one question. Did she kill him? And if the answer was yes, then the sentence was certain. The trial was set for October, barely 3 months later. In the meantime, Celia was held in a county jail cell, her fate sealed by men who saw her not as human, but as evidence. The irony was cruel. A woman who had been stripped of her rights in life would now be tried under a law that denied her humanity even in death. As the trial approached, the town buzzed with curiosity. Some whispered of justice, others of punishment, but none spoke of freedom. Celia's struggle had exposed something monstrous about the society around her. Yet instead of confronting that truth, the community prepared to sacrifice her in order to protect itself. October 9th, 1855. The courtroom in Callaway County filled with the weight of expectation. Farmers, townsfolk, and men of standing crowded the benches, eager to witness the trial of the enslaved girl accused of murdering her master. It was more than a trial. It was a spectacle, a performance meant to remind everyone of the boundaries of power. Celia was brought in, shackled, her body worn from months in a damp cell. She was 19, yet looked far older, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The jury was composed entirely of white men, neighbors, acquaintances, and peers of Robert Newsom. Men who lived by the same rules, profited by the same system, and carried the same unspoken guilt. To them, Celia was not a victim, she was a threat. Her defense was led by a handful of lawyers who attempted the impossible. They argued she had the right to defend herself from assault, that no law could demand a woman submit to violation. They pressed the court to consider her humanity, her pregnancy, her desperation. It was a radical argument for its time, one that cut against the grain of Missouri law. But the judge, William Hall, struck it down. He ruled the jury could not even consider whether she acted in self-defense against sexual assault. To do so would mean recognizing her as a woman with rights, not as a slave bound by ownership. The defense was crippled before it began. Witnesses were called. Neighbors testified about Newsom's disappearance. Slaves from the farm were forced to speak of the night, of the cabin, of the fire. The evidence was clear, yet it was evidence only of the act, not the years of suffering that had led to it. That suffering was invisible, erased by the very law that claimed to seek justice. By the second day, the verdict was inevitable. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence, death by hanging. In that moment, Celia's fate became more than personal. It became symbolic. Her execution would not simply punish her. It would silence the unspoken rebellion of every enslaved woman who dared resist. The court was sending a message. No matter the abuse, no matter the violation, you have no right to fight back. Yet in condemning her, they revealed their own terror. Because deep down, they knew Celia had done what every enslaved woman had dreamed of doing. The sentence of death did not fall like lightning. It came slowly, stretched over weeks, as if the state wanted to savor its control over Celia's final days. She was returned to the county jail to await her execution, set for November 16, 1855. But even here in the shadow of the gallows, the story refused to move cleanly, because some in the community, quietly, secretly, were unsettled by what had happened. There were whispers of escape. On the night before her scheduled hanging, Celia vanished from her cell. The jailer discovered the door unlocked, the bed empty, and panic rippled through the town. For a few hours, the illusion of order collapsed. Was she free? Had sympathizers smuggled her away into the darkness? Did she walk across the fields, swollen with pregnancy, finally tasting the air of liberty? The truth remains murky. Some accounts suggest local abolitionists orchestrated her escape, perhaps spiriting her northward on a fragment of the Underground Railroad. Others believe she was quickly recaptured, her attempt smothered before it could blossom into legend. What is certain is this. By late December, Celia was back in custody. The system had not let her go. Her execution was delayed until December 21st, perhaps because the court feared the scandal of her unborn child. The law refused to hang a pregnant woman, so they waited until she delivered. The baby, born in secret, nameless, faceless, was taken from her immediately, claimed as property of the Newsom estate. Celia was left with empty arms, her last tie to life severed before she faced death. The morning of December 21st was bitter cold. A crowd gathered to witness her hanging because public death was considered both justice and entertainment. The gallows loomed stark against the winter sky, a wooden structure built not merely to kill, but to display. Celia was led forward, thin, exhausted, but unbroken. Witnesses said she walked with dignity, refusing to bow her head. In those final moments, the silence of the crowd was heavy, as though every man and woman watching recognized a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. She was not dying because she was guilty. She was dying begged, or she had dared to resist. The trapdoor fell. The rope snapped taut, and with that, Celia's body swung against the sky, her story sealed in blood and silence. But silence is never permanent. After Celia's body hung lifeless from the gallows, the crowd dispersed in uneasy silence. No cheers, no sense of triumph, just the dull recognition that something more had died than a 19-year-old girl. The state thought it had ended her story, erased her resistance with a rope. But the truth is, death only deepened her presence. The memory of her defiance began to seep into the cracks of Missouri's conscience, a ghost that refused to rest. In the weeks that followed, newspapers reported the case with clinical detachment. To them, Celia was simply a slave who had killed her master, a legal matter concluded. But beneath the print, between the lines, an unspoken fear lingered. If one enslaved woman could rise up and strike back, how many others were quietly imagining the same? How many men, sitting smugly in their parlors, wondered if the women they claimed as property were secretly plotting their undoing? Her name traveled. In hushed voices, in secret gatherings, in the corners of slave cabins where whispers carried like sparks, Celia's story became more than tragedy. It became a warning and a symbol. Some spoke of her as doomed, a victim crushed by an unjust law. Others saw her as a martyr, proof that even the most powerless could resist, even if resistance meant death. The Newsom family tried to erase her. They took her children, folding them back into the machinery of slavery as if nothing had happened. They buried Robert Newsom's remains without ceremony, hoping the soil would cover their shame. But the stain could not be hidden. Neighbors remembered, the courts remembered. And history, though it tried to look away, eventually was forced to turn back. What makes Celia's case unbearable is not only the cruelty of her death, but the silence that followed. For decades she was a footnote, a name buried in court records, her humanity stripped away, even in memory. Yet the power of her act, those 2 strikes of the stick, that night of defiance, echoed beyond her grave. She became a question that refused to vanish. What happens when the law itself is the crime? Celia's life ended at 19, but her story did not. It became part of the darker bloodstream of America, proof that beneath the veneer of law and order lay a system so corrupt it demanded the execution of a girl who dared to say no, and no matter how hard they tried, that no could never be hanged. The gallows had done its work, but the real machinery behind Celia's death was not the rope. It was the court, the church, the community, and the laws that had wrapped themselves around her like chains long before she ever lifted the stick against Robert Newsom. This was not simply the story of a single girl condemned. It was a mirror held up to an entire society that thrived on erasing humanity when it became inconvenient. In Missouri's dusty court records, the trial of Celia was filed away like any other legal proceeding, as though it were nothing more than business concluded. The men who judged her, who signed her death into law, returned to their homes, to their wives, to their farms, and to their churches without hesitation. On Sundays they prayed for mercy, while knowing they had denied it to her. Their silence was not ignorance, it was choice. And yet, Celia's case planted an unease that grew in the shadows. The fact that her defense had even been attempted, that lawyers had stood in open court and argued that an enslaved woman had the right to defend herself against sexual assault, was itself a dangerous seed. Though the judge struck it down, though the jury ignored it, The very suggestion challenged the foundation of slavery, because if Celia had rights, then all enslaved women had rights. If she could resist, then others could resist. And if resistance was justified, the entire system was already rotting at its core. Her execution was supposed to silence that question. Instead, it whispered through cabins and across fields. It lingered in the thoughts of enslaved women who endured what she endured each night. It unsettled the men who depended on their silence. Even among abolitionists, Celia's story gained weight. She became an example they could point to, a living proof of slavery's brutality, a story that stripped away all illusions of paternalism and civility. But perhaps the deepest terror her case revealed was this. Robert Newsom had not been an outlier. He was ordinary. His violence was not hidden, it was known. His abuse was not punished, it was accepted. And when Celia fought back, the system rushed to defend him, even in death. That is the horror, not one man's cruelty, but a world built to protect it. Celia's body had been taken by the rope, but her defiance remained, haunting the conscience of a nation that could not bring itself to look her in the eyes. In the years following Celia's death, her story should have ended as a footnote, a name buried in court records. But history is rarely so obedient. Like a ghost pressing its hand against the walls of time, Celia's defiance refused to be erased, and the longer her silence lingered, the louder it became. The community that condemned her tried to move on, but there was no escaping the shadow of what had been done. Robert Newsom's farm carried the stain of it. The cabin where Celia had once lived and fought back stood as a silent monument, its wood darkened by memory. Neighbors who passed by could not help but recall the fire, the whispers of bones scattered in the fields, the trial that exposed the violence they had all chosen to ignore. That land, once seen as fertile and promising, now bore the reputation of blood. For enslaved people across Missouri, Celia, as act became legend. Not written in books, not spoken in daylight, but whispered in secret circles where fear and hope intertwined. Mothers told their daughters, "There was once a girl who said no, a girl who fought back, a girl who chose fire over submission, and though the rope took her life, her courage lived on, flickering like a candle in the darkness." Among white society, her case was something else entirely. A warning. Slaveholders tightened their control, fearful that resistance might spread. They saw in Celia not just a girl, but a dangerous possibility, that the silence they depended upon could one day shatter. Their fear was not unfounded, because every woman who endured what Celia endured now carried her story as a seed planted deep in the soil of memory. Years later, abolitionists uncovered her trial in yellowed records and carried her name northward. In speeches and pamphlets, they retold her story as proof that slavery was not merely an economic system, but a war against women, a violence so intimate that it demanded silence or death. Celia became both symbol and shadow, proof of cruelty, but also proof of resistance. And still, beneath all the retellings, the truth remained sharp. She was 19, pregnant, and alone when she chose to fight. Her act was not only defiance against one man, but against an entire system built to crush her spirit. That choice is what history could never bury, no matter how hard it tried. The trial of Celia may seem like an old and dusty case, sealed inside courthouse archives, but its poison still leaks into the veins of modern America. What the judges declared in 1855 was not simply a verdict, it was a message, written into the marrow of the nation. The law itself would protect power, even when that power was built on violence. And once a system makes violence legal, everything else becomes corruption wearing a mask of order. The jury did not see a young woman fighting for her body, her dignity, her unborn child. They saw only property. And the system calls a woman property. It is not only her life that is erased, but the very concept of justice itself. Missouri's courts made that clear. A slave could not legally defend herself against her master's assault. It was the legal codification of predation. Rape became ownership. Resistance became murder. Think about that. The same constitution that promised liberty to men of wealth and influence was used to chain silence around the throats of women like Celia. The trial exposed something horrifying. Not just the brutality of one man, but the machinery that allowed it to happen again and again. It was not an accident. It was design. A control system hidden in plain sight. That is why Celia's story is not just history. It is a mirror. How many systems still teach silence today? How many institutions punish the weak when they resist? Look closely, and you will see the blueprint repeating. Power writes the rules, and then calls those rules justice. And yet within this darkness, Celia's act refuses to be extinguished. She struck not only at her abuser, but at the illusion of invincibility that cloaked him. Her resistance was dangerous because it revealed a truth the system could not contain. Even those stripped of every right still carry the power to say no, to break the cycle, to burn the script written for them. When the state hung her, they believed they had erased the danger, but what they truly did was immortalize it. Because once a woman chooses fire over silence, her story becomes a spark that leaps across generations, waiting for men and women alike to ask the question, what else has been hidden from us? The gallows stood tall against the Missouri sky, rough wood splintered by weather, yet polished by the countless bodies it had carried into silence. On December 21st, 1855, Celia was led to that structure, her wrists bound, her steps slowed by the weight of a nation's cruelty pressing down on her shoulders. She was not just a woman walking toward death. She was the embodiment of every enslaved soul who had ever dared to resist. And that was the very reason they needed her gone. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what you are hearing now is not just history. It is the anatomy of power, dissected in its rawest form. The crowd that gathered was not there to seek justice. They were there for confirmation that the system still held, that rebellion could still be crushed, that silence could be enforced by rope and wood. They needed to see Celia die, because if she lived, it would mean their entire illusion of order could collapse under the weight of a woman's defiance. Witnesses claimed her face was calm, her gaze unwavering. Imagine that. A 19-year-old girl, carrying within her the scars of years of violation, walking into death without trembling. Some would call it courage, others would call it surrender. But in truth, it was neither. It was transformation. Celia understood something in those final moments that the court, the jury, and the executioners never could, that her story was already too powerful to be buried with her body. The rope tightened, the trapdoor fell, and in that instant, Missouri believed it had silenced her forever. But history is not so obedient. The state destroyed her life, but it could not destroy the seed of rebellion she had planted. Because here's the secret the system never wanted whispered: the act of resistance outlives the resistor. Celia's body fell lifeless, but her name rose into legend, echoing in hushed tones among the enslaved, and in later generations, who would uncover her trial as proof of America's darkest truth. She did not simply die, she became evidence. Evidence of the brutality hidden beneath the polished words of freedom. Evidence that power demands blood to sustain itself. Evidence that silence is not consent, but a prison built by fear. The gallows took her body. The story gave her immortality. And now, more than a century later, we are forced to ask, how many others like Celia were erased before their resistance could be recorded? The records of Celia's case were meant to sit quietly in the courthouse, buried under dust and legal jargon, stripped of emotion. But when we dig into them, when we listen beyond the cold words of judges and lawyers, we hear something else. A scream that was never supposed to be remembered. That scream was not just Celia's. It was the collective cry of countless women enslaved, violated, and erased by a system that called their suffering lawful. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what I'm about to reveal shows how deeply the system was designed to control not only bodies, but memory itself. Think about it. Why do you know the names of the men who signed declarations and drafted laws, but not the women who resisted in silence, or the children whose lives were stolen before they began? Because history is curated by the victors, and victors do not write about the screams of those they've crushed. Celia's trial survived not because they wanted her remembered, but because they needed her case as precedent, proof that even the most brutal control could be legalized. But here is where the machinery of control falters. Once those records exist, once her name is written down, the system cannot fully erase her. Celia's story slipped through the cracks of suppression, carried into the future like a forbidden secret. Each word of her trial transcript became a weapon against the very system that created it. And here lies the true horror. Celia's case was not unique. She was not the first woman forced into this nightmare, nor the last. Across plantations, across towns, across decades, the same script played out. Power cloaked itself in law, violence wore the mask of ownership, and silence was enforced by death. Celia's courage forces us to confront how many others vanished into the shadows, nameless, their stories never recorded, their screams swallowed by the earth. The chilling truth is this. The United States was built not only on labor stolen from enslaved bodies, but on the destruction of memory itself. By erasing the voices of women like Celia, the system tried to erase the possibility of resistance. And yet, here we are, speaking her name. That is the crack in their design. That is the ghost that haunts their legacy. Celia was hung to silence her, but every retelling brings her closer to resurrection. On cold winter nights in Missouri, whispers traveled among the enslaved. Whispers about the girl who refused to bow, the girl who struck back, the girl whose name the courts tried to bury under verdicts and rope. These whispers were dangerous, because in them was a spark, and sparks ignite fires that no gallows can extinguish. Celia's death did not silence her, it multiplied her. Hit that subscribe button, and comment below what state you're listening from, because this next truth is the one history textbooks never dared to print. Plantations thrived on control of labor, of bodies, of minds. Fear was their currency, and silence was their weapon. But Celia shattered that silence. She showed that resistance was possible, even when every law, every weapon, and every tradition screamed otherwise. For the enslaved who heard her story, it was not just tragedy, it was instruction. If the system could be defied once, it could be defied again. The slaveholders too understood this. That is why they paraded her execution like theater, why they made sure the community saw her punishment. They needed to remind everyone of the cost of rebellion. But here's the irony. By turning her death into spectacle, they ensured her story lived longer than they ever intended. Her name lingered in the air, her act retold in secret corners, her defiance transforming from crime into legend. This is how forbidden histories survive, not through books, not through monuments, but through whispers carried across generations. And sometimes the whispers are louder than any law. Celia's courage became a ghost haunting Missouri's fields, a reminder that control was never absolute, that the enslaved carried power the system feared more than anything, the power to say no. And yet, we must also face the brutal reality. Her execution was not the end of violence, but the continuation of it. After Celia, countless others suffered in silence, their resistance erased before it could take form. The system learned to hide its crimes better, to mask its brutality behind legal words and polished speeches. The ghost of Celia stood as both inspiration and warning. Resistance is possible, but resistance demands blood. Her story is not a relic of 1855. It is a blueprint, a coded message hidden inside history, waiting for those willing to see it. Because once you hear it, once you feel the weight of her defiance, you cannot unhear the question she left behind. If she found the courage to resist with nothing, what excuse do we have with everything? The courtroom where Celia's fate was sealed still stands as a monument, not of justice, but of betrayal. Within its walls, men in fine coats and polished boots declared that a woman's body could be owned, that her resistance was not self-defense but rebellion, that her voice was irrelevant against the property rights of her master. The air in that room must have been heavy, not only with her fear but with the stench of hypocrisy. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what unfolded in that courtroom reveals how law itself can become a weapon of enslavement. The trial transcripts are chilling when read carefully. The defense argued that Celia had the right to protect herself, that she acted out of desperation after her years of violation, but the prosecution dismissed her humanity altogether. They reduced her to an object, a possession, a tool. And the jury, white men sworn to uphold the illusion of justice, chose property over personhood. Their verdict was not based on truth, it was based on preservation of power. Here lies the terrifying part. The law did not fail Celia. It did exactly what it was designed to do. The system was never built to protect her, it was built to protect the men who enslaved her. That is why the outcome was inevitable. To free her would have been to admit that the entire structure of slavery was incompatible with justice, and the state of Missouri was not ready to let the illusion collapse. The verdict was more than a sentence against one woman. It was a declaration of war against the possibility of resistance. It told every enslaved woman, your body is not yours. It told every enslaved man, your silence is demanded. And it told the world, this is the price of defiance. But history has a way of turning weapons back on their masters. The trial meant to erase Celia instead immortalized her. Her name is remembered, her courage studied, her defiance whispered into the future. The men who condemned her are forgotten, their power reduced to dust. She, the enslaved girl they tried to destroy, became eternal. This is the paradox of oppression. The harder it tries to silence, the louder the silence becomes. Celia's trial was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a haunting that still lingers. Imagine the silence of the jail cell on the night before her execution. The walls damp with cold, the air thick with the stench of decay, and in the center, Celia, only 19, waiting for dawn to deliver her to the gallows. Outside, the world carried on, indifferent. Inside, she carried the unbearable weight of every woman whose screams had been ignored, every child torn from its mother, every life devoured by the system. That night, the silence must have been louder than any scream. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what the state you're listening from, because this is where the story takes its darkest turn, where humanity itself is tested. What did she think as she sat in that cell? Did she pray for mercy or curse the God who seemed to have abandoned her? Did she regret striking the blow, or did she hold on to it as her only act of freedom? We will never know her final thoughts, and perhaps that is the greatest cruelty. The system denied her not only her future but also her last words. They allowed no record of her voice, only the record of her condemnation. The jailers, the court, the jury, they believed they had the power. But what if, in those final hours, Celia had a power they could never touch? The power of knowing she had refused to be silent. The power of knowing she had broken the script written for her life. That, in itself, was rebellion. When dawn came, and footsteps echoed down the hall, she did not walk alone. Every enslaved woman silenced before her walked with her. Every unborn child lost in the darkness of slavery walked with her. Every man broken under the lash walked with her. And though the world outside celebrated her death as justice, the truth is that she had already escaped them. Because death can end a life, but it cannot end a defiance that has already taken root. Her cell, her gallows, her silence, all of it became part of the legend they tried to bury. And in the end, the rope that was supposed to erase her became the thread that stitched her name into eternity. Celia's final night was not just the end of a girl's life. It was the beginning of a haunting that history has never been able to silence. The morning of December 21st, 1855, arrived with a chilling clarity. The sun rose as it always did, but for Celia, the light was not salvation, it was a spotlight, casting her final act upon the stage of Missouri's cruelty. She was led from her cell, wrists bound, body forsaken, fragile, but her spirit carrying a defiance too large for the gallows. Every step she took toward that wooden structure was a reminder she was being killed not because she had done wrong, but because she had refused to remain silent. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what happened next is not just history, it is ritual, a public display meant to terrify and to control. The crowd gathered early. Men, women, and even children pressed forward to witness what they were told was justice. Some came for spectacle, others for reassurance. The slaveholding class needed proof that the system still worked, that rebellion could be punished swiftly and without mercy. But hidden among the faces were those who carried different emotions: fear, grief, and even quiet admiration. For the enslaved, watching Celia mount the gallows was like watching hope burn alive. And yet, it was also a lesson. Celia's face, according to those who dared recall it, held no tears, no begging, no frantic cries for mercy. Just silence. And in that silence was power. Because silence, when chosen, is not weakness, it is defiance. She denied her captors the satisfaction of her fear. She gave them only stillness, a final refusal to be broken. Then came the rope. Rough, thick, reeking of sweat and old blood. It was placed around her neck, the knot tightened with mechanical efficiency. The executioner pulled the lever, and in that instant, the state of Missouri believed it had closed the chapter. They believed the rope had ended the story, but the rope did something else. It tied Celia's name to a truth that could never again be hidden. The truth that even in the heart of slavery, even in the darkest corridors of oppression, resistance was possible. She did not die as property. She died as defiance incarnate. The crowd dispersed. The gallows stood empty. But the silence that followed was louder than any cheer, louder than any sermon, louder than the law itself. It was the silence of a ghost taking root in history. When Celia's body swung lifeless from the gallows, the crowd eventually scattered, their footsteps fading into the muddy streets of Missouri. Some walked away satisfied, believing order had been restored. Others whispered uneasily, shaken by the quiet dignity of the girl they had just watched die. But the truth is this: the execution was not the end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous to the system: memory. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because this is where the hidden power of Celia's story begins to reveal itself. Plantation owners wanted her name erased, her defiance forgotten, but human beings are not so obedient. Among the enslaved, her act became a story passed in secret, retold in whispers by firelight, shared like a forbidden prayer. Mothers would warn their daughters of the dangers, yet at the same time, they would carry in their voices a quiet pride. Fathers would tell their sons not only of the gallows, but of the courage it took to swing that stick, to strike against the impossible. The white authorities feared these whispers more than rebellion itself, because rebellion begins not with weapons, but with stories. And Celia's story carried a truth that could not be contained. The system was not invincible. One enslaved girl had proved it with fire and with defiance. Think about how power works. It depends on belief. If the enslaved believe the master is unbreakable, control remains absolute. But if even one story circulates of a master defeated, of a system resisted, that belief begins to crack. Celia's death was supposed to close that crack. Instead, it widened it. In the years that followed, her case disappeared from newspapers, buried by silence. But in oral traditions, in the hidden memory of the oppressed, her ghost remained. Every retelling was an act of rebellion. Very whisper kept alive the question Missouri wanted erased. If Celia could say no, why can't we? And here is the paradox of history. The rope they used to kill her was supposed to be an ending. Instead, it became a thread connecting her defiance to every act of resistance that followed. From secret escapes to open revolts, the memory of Celia lived, not in books, but in the pulse of rebellion. Celia did not vanish on the gallows. she multiplied. In the aftermath of Celia's execution, Missouri's leaders congratulated themselves. They believed they had preserved the illusion of order, that the rope had silenced not just a girl, but the possibility of resistance itself. But history has a cruel sense of irony. The very trial transcripts they preserved as legal precedent became the evidence of their brutality. What they intended as proof of law now stands as proof of injustice. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what I'm about to uncover shows how the system accidentally immortalized the very woman it tried to erase. Think about it. Without the court records, Celia would have vanished into anonymity, one among millions erased by the machinery of slavery. But because her case was written down, her name survived. Every word of testimony, every argument, every cold legal phrase is a fossilized record of resistance. The same documents designed to condemn her became the documents that resurrected her. This is how forbidden history often survives, not through monuments or memory, but through the arrogance of power. They thought the record would prove their authority forever. Instead, it proves their corruption. Today, when we read those transcripts, we don't see justice. We see the face of a system built on violence, stripped naked by its own words, and this forces us to ask, how many other Celias were lost because their stories were never recorded? For every trial transcript that survived, countless women were silenced, with no record at all. Their resistance is buried in unmarked graves, their screams lost to the wind. Celia's survival in history is both miracle and indictment, a reminder of how much has been erased. But here is the terrifying beauty. Once a story like Celia's reemerges, it cannot be forgotten again. It lingers, unsettles, refuses to rest. Her defiance lives in the cracks of the system, haunting every attempt to sanitize America's past. Missouri tried to bury her under law. Instead, they handed her immortality. Celia was never meant to be remembered, and yet, because of their arrogance, she became unforgettable. That is the curse of oppression. It always leaves behind ghosts. The question that hangs in the air like smoke is this: why was Celia's story buried for so long? Why did it take more than a century for historians to dig into those fragile courthouse papers and uncover the truth? The answer is as unsettling as the crime itself, because remembering her would have meant admitting that the foundation of justice in America was built on the bones of the oppressed. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what I'm about to reveal shows how forgetting is not an accident. It is strategy. After Celia's execution, Missouri had every reason to keep her story silent. For slaveholders, her defiance was a dangerous symbol. For politicians, it was a crack in the myth of law and order. For society at large, it was a reminder that slavery was not just labor, it was a war on women's bodies. To let Celia's memory live would have been to acknowledge that the system demanded the destruction of humanity itself. And so, her story was locked away. Generations passed without her name being spoken in classrooms, without monuments marking her defiance, without sermons recalling her courage. Silence became its own kind of execution, a second death meant to erase what the rope could not. But silence has limits. History, see, and not be buried forever. When Celia's trial records were rediscovered in the 20th century, they carried with them a chilling revelation. The law had not failed her. It had worked exactly as intended, to protect ownership, not humanity. To call her guilty was not a miscarriage of justice, it was the very definition of justice under slavery. And that truth is far more terrifying than any gallows. Celia's return from the archives was like a ghost breaking through the floorboards of history. Suddenly, the nation was forced to confront a question it had long avoided. If law itself can sanctify violence, what does justice even mean? Her story shattered the illusion that slavery was just an economic system. It revealed it for what it was, a machine of legalized violation, fueled by silence and upheld by rope. This is why Celia matters. Not because she was the only one, but because her story survived when so many others were erased. Her name forces us to remember the unremembered, to hear the voices that the system tried to bury. The figure of Celia forces us into a brutal recognition. She was not only a victim, not only a defiant young woman, she was a mirror that shows us how law, faith and power can all conspire to sanctify violence. When the jury declared her guilty, when the preacher prayed over her execution, when the townsfolk brought their children to watch, each one became part of the machine. Each one turned their face from her humanity, choosing order over truth. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because the question that her death leaves behind is not about her. It's about us. What does it mean to live in a society where murder becomes law, where assault becomes ownership, where silence is mistaken for justice? Missouri in 1855 was not an outlier. It was a blueprint, and blueprints are meant to be copied. The machinery of control that killed Celia did not end with her. It evolved, shifting shapes, hiding behind new words, but always serving the same purpose: to protect Poe. Where? Think about the ritual of her execution. A young woman hung before a crowd, her death transformed into public theater. That was not punishment. That was instruction. It was a lesson broadcast to every enslaved person. This is what happens when you resist. But hidden within that same spectacle was another lesson, one unintended. This is what it takes to keep the system alive. Rope, gallows, silence, terror. Without these, the illusion collapses. And so, Celia's ghost lingers. Not because we remember her willingly, but because the system that killed her still echoes around us. Every time we see power excuse its own violence, every time the weak are blamed for resisting the strong, every time the law defends brutality instead of humanity, Celia's story returns. It is not just about slavery. It is about the design of control itself. Her defiance was a rupture in that design, a reminder that no system, no matter how powerful, is absolute. Even a 19-year-old girl stripped of everything could strike against it. That act reverberates across centuries, forcing us to confront the question her executioners tried to silence. What happens when the oppressed stop obeying the script written for them? The answer terrifies those in power. And that is why Celia's story will never rest. There is something chilling about how Celia's story was staged, because that's exactly what it was. A performance. From the moment she struck back to the moment the rope snapped, every step of her journey was turned into theater for the powerful. The trial was a script written to reassure slaveholders. The verdict was a performance of order. The execution was a public play meant to terrify the enslaved into submission. But performances have a weakness. They reveal what the actors want to hide. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what I'm about to reveal shows how Celia's execution exposed the system more than it protected it. The courtroom claimed to be neutral, but neutrality is a lie when the rules themselves are poisoned. The jury did not weigh justice, they performed loyalty. The preacher's prayer was not for Celia's soul, it was for the comfort of those who killed her. The gallows were not just wood and rope. They were a stage, designed to broadcast the message: resistance will not be tolerated. But here is the crack in their design. The more elaborate the performance, the more it betrays its own fragility. If the system were truly strong, it would not need spectacle. If slaveholders were truly unshakable, they would not need to parade a young girl's corpse to prove their power. The very fact that they hung Celia publicly proves how terrified they were of her defiance. And that is why her ghost remains so unsettling, because her silence at the gallows spoke louder than their entire performance. She denied them fear, denied them submission. She became a mirror reflecting their violence back at them. And in that reflection, the truth was undeniable. The system depended not on strength, but on fear. Every society has its performances. Every age has its stagecraft of power. But Celia's case strips away the illusion. It shows us the raw mechanics of control, how law, religion, and ritual can be fused into a theater of dominance. And once you see the theater for what it is, you can never see it the same way again. Celia's life ended in a performance of death, But her memory survives as the truth behind the curtain, and that truth is this: power is always weakest when it screams the loudest. The system wanted Celia forgotten, buried beneath ashes and silence. But history has a strange way of refusing to cooperate with power. The very records meant to condemn her, the testimonies, the trial notes, the execution reports, are the same ones that keep her memory alive. The evidence of her supposed guilt is the evidence of their cruelty. They built her gallows, but in doing so they carve add her name into history. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because once you understand how power tries to erase its enemies, you'll never look at history the same way again. Think about it. Every empire tries to destroy the memory of those who resist. Rome scraped names off stone. The Inquisition burned books. Slaveholders hanged Celia and silenced her voice. But no matter how brutal the attempt, something always slips through. A record, a rumor, a fragment of testimony, just enough for the future to reconstruct what they tried to erase. Celia's story exists today because suppression always leaves fingerprints, and those fingerprints reveal the real crime, not the murder of Robert Newsom, but the system that forced a child into a nightmare she could never escape. The trial records don't show a murderer. They show a society terrified of its own reflection. They show a system so corrupt that it could not afford to admit even a single instance of justified resistance. But here is the uncomfortable truth. They are still trying to bury her. Not with gallows this time, but with silence. Her case is rarely taught, rarely discussed, rarely remembered in the grand narratives of American history. And that silence is not accidental. It is the continuation of the same system that killed her. To forget her is to let the performance succeed. And this is why you are here listening now. You are not just hearing a story. You are reopening a wound that was never meant to heal. You are bearing witness to a truth that power wanted erased. And by remembering her, you are doing the most dangerous thing a man can do in any age: breaking the silence. Celia's ghost does not haunt us to terrify. She haunts us to remind that when power tries to erase resistance, it always leaves behind the one thing it cannot destroy: memory. Memory is dangerous because, see, it spreads. A single story, whispered in the right ear, can unravel centuries of silence. Celia's memory, fragile as it seemed, traveled like smoke, seeping through cracks, staining every surface it touched. And once it is inhaled, it cannot be forgotten. That is why systems of power fight so hard to control the past, because memory fuels resistance more than laws or weapons ever could. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what I'm about to show you proves how the ghosts of history are never truly gone. They're waiting for someone willing to listen. Imagine the enslaved who stood outside the courthouse, ears straining to catch each word of Celia's trial. Imagine the whispers that followed her execution, mothers telling daughters, fathers warning sons. No matter how tightly the authorities tried to bind the story, it escaped. Not in official histories, but in hushed conversations, in songs, in fragments of memory passed hand to hand like contraband. And here's the terrifying part for those in power: memory does not obey their rules. It is not confined to borders, courts, or sermons. It bleeds across time. The fear that Celia's defiance inspired in 1855 is the same fear that haunted slaveholders in every rebellion, from Nat Turner to the countless unnamed who broke their chains in silence. Each memory linked to the next, forming a chain stronger than any iron. But memory cuts both ways. For the enslaved, Celia was a symbol of courage. For the masters, she became a shadow that refused to die, a reminder that no one, no matter how young, no matter how trapped, was ever truly broken. That shadow lived in their nightmares, in the flicker of firelight, in the uneasy silence after the crack of a whip. Celia's ghost was not in the grave. It was in their minds. And here is the revelation: power can kill a body, but it cannot kill the meaning of resistance. The meaning lingers, grows, multiplies. Celia may have died on the gallows, but her defiance lived on in every whispered story, every remembered glance, every silent act of rebellion that followed. The system thought it destroyed her. In reality, it made her immortal. By the time the rope was cut and Celia's body removed, the performance was over. But the unease lingered. Those who built the gallows wanted closure, a final act that sealed the story. Instead, they unleashed something they could not contain. The crowd that watched her die left with more questions than answers. And questions are the seeds of rebellion. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because this next truth will show you why Celia's case was never just about one enslaved girl. It was about the cracks in an empire built on silence. The law claimed she was guilty. The preacher claimed she was sinful. The jury claimed they had no choice. But deep down, everyone who witnessed her trial knew what had happened. A young girl was trapped, brutalized, and forced into an impossible decision. Her execution was not justice. It was fear disguised as law, and fear has a way of eating away at the foundations of power. The whispers began almost immediately, not in the newspapers where her story was carefully controlled, but in kitchens, in fields, in back rooms. Enslaved women told Celia's story as a warning and as a beacon. Enslaved men repeated it as proof that resistance was possible, even if it came at the highest price. The very act meant to silence her turned her into a signal. For the masters, it was the opposite. Her memory became a curse. Every time a woman turned her eyes away from her owner, he remembered Celia. Every time a field hand gripped a tool too tightly, he remembered Celia. Her name was not spoken aloud, but it lived beneath their skin, a constant reminder that their world rested on the fragile obedience of the people they enslaved. And so Celia's death did not end her story. It spread it. She became less a person and more a haunting, not a ghost that rattled chains in the night, but one that lived, in conscience, in shame, in unspoken fear. The gallows silenced her voice, but it could not silence the truth her life revealed. That the system was built not on justice, not on law, but on the daily, grinding violence against the innocent. And once exposed, that truth could never be buried again. The deeper you look into Celia's case, the more you see it was never just about one enslaved girl. It was about the fragility of an entire order. The trial was supposed to prove the strength of the slaveholding system. Instead, it revealed its weakness. For if it took a jury, a preacher, a sheriff, and a public execution to suppress the voice of a teenage girl, what did that say about the foundation they stood on? Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because the truth I'm about to share shows how Celia's case was not an ending, but the beginning of something they could never control. Look at the cracks. The jury had to ignore the law to convict her. The preacher had to twist scripture to justify her death. The sheriff had to rush the execution before too many questions spread. Every step they took was not strength, it was desperation. They were patching holes in a dam already leaking, and outside that courtroom, the whispers grew bolder. For the enslaved, Celia became a secret kind of scripture, proof that even the smallest voice could shake the mightiest system. For abolitionists, her case became ammunition, a story that exposed slavery for what it truly was, legalized violence against women, children, and the powerless. The more they tried to bury her, the more she surfaced in conversations, speeches, and hidden prayers. But the most haunting part is this. Celia's execution was supposed to erase fear from the masters and inspire fear in the enslaved. Instead, it did the reverse. The masters walked away uneasy, their confidence cracked. The enslaved walked away with a memory they could not let go, a reminder that defiance was possible, even in the darkest circumstances. And that reversal is the real power of her story. It shows that control is never absolute. It shows that fear is a blade that cuts both ways. It shows that even when a system seems unshakable, one act, one moment of courage, can reveal the weakness hidden beneath its surface. Celia's case was meant to close a door. Instead, it opened one. A door that led to rebellion, memory, and truth. A door that has never been fully shut. Power always believes it can bury its mistakes, but the earth never keeps secrets for long. Celia's grave, unmarked and forgotten, was supposed to erase her from memory. Yet the silence around it speaks louder than any monument. The absence itself is evidence. For when a society works this hard to forget, you must ask, what are they so afraid you'll remember? Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what I'm about to uncover shows how forgetting is not weakness, it is strategy, and it is still being used today. The court records remain, but they are skeletal. Names, dates, verdicts. No tears, no screams, no silences recorded between the words. They tell you what happened, but not how it felt. And yet the emptiness is revealing. The missing pieces are not accidents, they are erasures. Each silence is a deliberate choice, proof that someone feared what truth might spread if it was written down. This is how systems of control operate. They kill the body, then they kill the memory. They strip away humanity, leaving only fragments, hoping the fragments are not enough to spark recognition. But fragments have power. Even one piece of a broken mirror can reflect the face of a monster. And when we look into Celia's fragments, we see not just her story, but the story of every silenced voice. The unnamed women forced into silence, the children born into chains, the countless whose resistance never made it into the record. Celia is both one girl and all of them at once. That is why her ghost is unbearable for those who cling to the myth of order. Her unmarked grave does not erase her, it multiplies her. Every unremembered death joins hers, swelling into a chorus that will not stay quiet. You can feel it in the tension of history, in the questions left unanswered, in the way her name keeps surfacing despite every attempt to bury it. The truth is this: forgetting is never permanent. Silence is never total. The earth does not keep secrets. It preserves them, waiting for someone with ears sharp enough to hear. Celia's story survived because the silence itself became suspicious, and once suspicion is born, forgetting is no longer possible. Her grave may be empty of markers, but it is overflowing with meaning. The silence around Celia's grave was not just about forgetting her, it was about protecting the system that killed her. To remember her would have meant admitting that a girl could be both enslaved and innocent, both powerless and justified in striking back. That kind of memory was too dangerous, so they chose erasure. But erasure is never perfect. It always leaves behind traces, and traces are enough to haunt the living. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because the truth I'm about to reveal shows how ghosts are not born from superstition. They are born from unfinished justice. Think of it this way: a ghost is not a soul trapped between worlds. A ghost is the echo of something unresolved, something denied the closure it deserved. Celia was denied justice, denied a voice, denied even a grave that bore her name. That denial created the conditions for haunting, and haunting does not fade with time, it deepens. In the counties around her execution, stories lingered. People claimed to hear cries near the gallows site, or to see a young woman's shadow walking the fields at night. Was it superstition? Maybe. Or maybe it was the conscience of a people trying to tell itself a story it refused to admit in daylight. Haunting is often nothing more than guilt made visible. But Celia's ghost is not just local, it is national. Every time her name resurfaces in history, it carries that unfinished weight. She does not haunt with rattling chains, but with questions that refuse to die. What does it mean to call a law just if it protects only the oppressor? What does it mean to demand obedience when obedience is slavery? What does it mean to call a child guilty when her only crime was survival? These questions are the ghost. They follow you, demand answers, force you to see what the system tried to hide, and the longer they go unanswered, the stronger they become. That is why Celia still walks with us, not as a wraith, but as a reckoning. Her ghost is not about fear. It is about exposure. It is the truth that refused to stay buried. What makes Celia's story unbearable is not just the violence she endured, but the questions she left behind. A system that claimed to be lawful, righteous, and civilized could not survive those questions. That is why her memory was attacked with such precision, silenced in court, buried in shame, stripped from history. But when you silence someone so completely, their absence becomes louder than their voice ever was. That is the paradox of Celia. They tried to erase her, and in doing so they immortalized her. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what I'm about to reveal shows how her silence became a weapon sharper than any blade. Imagine the jurors, sworn to uphold the law. They sat, knowing the statute said she had the right to defend herself against sexual assault, and yet they condemned her anyway. Though her silence was not ignorance, it was collusion. Every man in that room chose silence over truth, obedience over justice. They killed her not only with rope, but with their refusal to speak what they knew was right. That silence was the first haunting. Then came the preacher. He offered prayers for her soul, but never once acknowledged the crime that had been committed against her. His silence wrapped violence in scripture, turning faith into a shield for cruelty. That silence was the second haunting. And then, after the execution, the community buried her story under silence, pretending her death had restored order. But order built on silence is always fragile. Every unspoken truth trembles beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. That silence was the third haunting. What they did not understand was this: silence is never empty. It carries weight, it festers, it multiplies. Each refusal to speak the truth about Celia created a wound in the collective conscience, and wounds that are not treated do not heal, they infect everything around them. Celia's silence became a contagion, spreading through generations, demanding to be remembered. Her ghost is not the image of a girl on the gallows. Her ghost is the silence that hung in the air after the rope snapped, the silence of jurors, preachers, neighbors, and historians. That silence is still with us, heavy, pressing, waiting for someone to break it. And when you hear her story now, you are not just listening. You are breaking a silence that has lasted for more than a century. You are doing what they feared most, giving her voice back. Every society has its ghosts, and Celia's ghost is not bound to a single field in Missouri. She moves with time, appearing wherever silence covers injustice. That is why her story still matters, because the very patterns that destroyed her are still with us. The courtroom that silenced her is not gone. It has only changed its name, its laws, its stagecraft, and if you look closely, you will see her reflection in every trial where the powerless are blamed for surviving the powerful. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because the truth I'm about to share shows how Celia's ghost is not just history. It is a warning. Consider this. Celia was condemned because she refused to accept the role they wrote for her. She was supposed to endure abuse quietly, to bear her suffering invisibly, to live and die without protest. By breaking that script, she exposed the lie at the core of the system, that obedience was natural, that silence was inevitable. Her defiance shattered the illusion, even if only for a moment. That illusion has not vanished. Modern systems still rely on silence to survive, silence about violence, silence about inequality, silence about who pays the cost for someone else's comfort. Every time a victim is told to stay quiet for the sake of reputation, every time a law is twisted to protect the powerful, every time a life is buried without justice, Celia's ghost is there, reminding us that silence is never neutral. Silence always takes a side. This is why her story burns through the years. It is not just a relic of slavery, it is a mirror. When you hear Celia's name, you are forced to ask yourself, where do I see her today? Whose voice is being buried now? Whose suffering is being erased by silence? And what does it cost us to look away? The haunting is not about fear of shadows, it is about responsibility. Celia's ghost follows us because the silence that killed her still lives among us. Until that silence is broken, she cannot rest. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps she is not meant to. Her story is not a closed book. It is an open wound, demanding that we stop pretending it has healed. By now you can see that Celia's story is not locked in the past. It bleeds into the present. The haunting is not a tale of superstition, but of unfinished head reckoning. When a society kills truth, the ghost that rises is not a spirit in the dark, but a shadow in the conscience. And Celia's shadow is everywhere power hides behind silence. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what I'm about to reveal shows why Celia's ghost is more alive today than at any moment since the rope snapped. Think of the courtroom where she was condemned. The wood may have rotted, the records may have yellowed, but the pattern remains. Again and again, the powerless are placed on trial, while the crimes of the powerful are excused. The stage changes, but the script is the same, and in every echo of that script, Celia stands at the edge of the room, watching, reminding, refusing to vanish. Think of the silence that surrounded her grave. Today silence takes other forms, files sealed, voices discredited, stories untold. The strategy is unchanged. Erase the victim, protect the system. But silence never truly buries. It only delays the eruption. Celia's silence erupted more than a century later, and it still shakes us now. And think of the haunting, not the ghostly figure in a white dress drifting through cornfields, but the haunting that lives in memory, in the questions we cannot escape. Why was her life deemed disposable? Why was her suffering dismissed? Why did the system need her silence more than her death? These questions are not history. They are alive, pulsing, demanding to be answered in every age. Here is the final truth of this section. Celia's ghost is not a relic. It is a summons. She is not asking us to mourn her. She is asking us to confront the silence that still poisons the world. She is asking us to speak where others were silenced, to remember where others were erased, to resist where others were forced to obey. Her haunting is not punishment. It is a test of whether we will continue the silence or finally break it. A haunting always has two sides, the ghost and the living who are willing or unwilling to face it. Celia's ghost lingers not because she cannot rest, but because we have not yet answered her. Every generation inherits her silence, and every generation must decide what to do with it. Ignore it, and the cycle repeats. Confront it, and the silence shatters. That choice is ours, and it has always been ours. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what I'm about to reveal shows that Celia's story is not just a warning, it is a demand. Look carefully at the trial. The jurors, the preacher, the sheriff, they all claimed they had no choice. They all said the law bound them. But law is not a force of nature. It is a choice made by men, and choices can be unmade. The truth is not that they had no choice, but that they chose power over justice, silence over truth. Celia's ghost does not let us forget that. And now the same question falls on us. What do we choose when faced with injustice today? Do we bury it under silence? Do we say it is the law? Do we look away because the cost of looking is too heavy? Or do we remember the girl they tried to erase and refuse to play the same role they played? This is the weight of her haunting. It is not about fear. It is about responsibility. Every time we hear her name, we are reminded that silence is complicity. Every time her story is told, we are forced to ask whether we will repeat the same choices that condemned her. Celia's case was not the failure of one courtroom. It was the failure of an entire society to see her humanity. And society still fails again and again, in new forms, in new trials, in new silences. Her haunting insists that we cannot claim ignorance. We cannot say, "We did not know," because now we do. Her ghost stands in the space between history and the present, pointing at us with the same unspoken question: will you keep me silent, or will you finally speak? That is the haunting. That is the demand. Celia's haunting. grows heavier the closer we move to the present, because her silence was never fully broken. It was only delayed. For more than a century, her story remained buried in archives, whispered about in fragments, and ignored in the grand narrative of America. That neglect is not accidental. It is proof that the same silence that killed her still lingers in us. And every time her name resurfaces, it is as if the earth itself is demanding that the silence end. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what I'm about to reveal is not history. It is the unfinished echo of her trial still unfolding. Think of the way her story was rediscovered. Historians digging through forgotten records found the fragments, court transcripts, witness testimonies, execution notes. Each document was a bone, a piece of a body long buried. Slowly they assembled the skeleton of her life, piecing together the horror she endured. But even in rediscovery she was incomplete. No diary, no words in her own hand, no record of her final thoughts. That absence is the silence, staring back at us like a hollow eye. But here's the truth. Absence can speak. The very fact that her words are missing tells us everything we need to know. They were taken, they were silenced, and the silence itself is her testimony. It says louder than any transcript. I was not allowed to speak. They feared my truth so much, they erased it. And now, when her story is told, it becomes more than remembrance. It becomes defiance. Every retelling rips another stone from the wall of silence. Every listener becomes a witness the courtroom tried to erase. And every time her ghost is invoked, the system that killed her is exposed again, stripped bare before the eyes of the living. This is why her haunting still matters. It is not about shadows on the gallows or whispers in the fields. It is about the fact that silence cannot last forever. Eventually the dead demand their voice. Eventually history demands its reckoning. Celia's silence was their weapon, but today her silence is your evidence. Evidence that the system was guilty and she was not. Evidence that memory is stronger than erasure. Evidence that the ghost remains because justice has not yet been served. This is where the haunting ends, or perhaps where it truly begins. Celia's rope snapped her body, but it did not end her story. Her grave is unmarked, her voice is gone, her words erased, but her silence has become a weapon sharper than any blade. For what they tried to bury has risen again, and now we must decide what to do with it. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're listening from, because what I'm about to say is not just about Celia, it's about us, here and now. Celia's case is more than history. It is a mirror. When we look into it, we do not just see a frightened teenage girl on the gallows. We see ourselves, our systems, our silences. We see every courtroom where the powerless are condemned for surviving. We see every preacher who twists scripture to defend cruelty. We see every community that chooses comfort over truth. The haunting is not hers. It is ours. Her ghost asks a simple question, and it will not rest until it is answered. Will you let silence kill again, or will you speak? That is the demand left hanging in the air since 1855, carried through generations, waiting for someone bold enough to respond. And make no mistake, speaking is dangerous. It was dangerous for her, and it is dangerous still. But silence is far worse. Silence is complicity. Silence is the gallows, rebuilt each time we choose not to see. Celia's story teaches us this. Ghosts do not appear to terrify, they appear to remind. They return because justice was denied, because memory was buried, because truth was strangled. And until those things are restored, the haunting will continue. The performance of her death was supposed to close her story forever. Instead, it opened a wound that refuses to heal. And maybe that wound is not meant to heal. Maybe it is meant to stay open, raw, unignorable, a reminder of what happens when we allow silence to rule. Celia does not need our pity. She needs our memory. She needs us to look at her trial, her death, her silence, and refuse to let it happen again. That is her legacy. That is the haunting. That is the truth they feared most. The rope killed her body. The silence tried to kill her memory, but her ghost endures, because the truth cannot die.